Okay, this is just a little explanatory video on this particular article titled Agriculture and the Origins of the State in Ancient Egypt. This is really important for our class because it's really talking about sustainability in a number of different ways without actually naming sustainability. And I've been talking about how you actually read articles. So we're going to do something similar where I would like you to read the abstract first, and that's at the very beginning, even though it doesn't have an abstract, and then read a bit of the introduction. Now, the conclusion is a bit different in this particular article, so I don't think it'll be helpful to go to the conclusion third and then come back. So what we're going to do is we'll follow the order that the article was written in. So with the abstract, so we are talking about the origin of a government in ancient Egypt and how that actually happened. And you can see I've highlighted some important parts. This is what the paper is about. This paper argues that successful states in the ancient world depended on the ability of elites to extract a surplus. This ability was greatest when the population was immobile, meaning they couldn't move for whatever reason. And so this is what the paper is. He's going to suggest that the origin of the state was helped by the geography of the Nile Valley, where people can't really go off into the deserts to escape. They can go south and north, but they're sort of limited in their movement. And so this author, Alan, is going to suggest that the government was created and then was able to grow because the people couldn't move around very much. They were sort of stuck where they were. This article starts off with a little bit of introduction on the history of the state, and we'll talk about this in a lecture. It asks, now remember when I told you about how to create your papers for the podcast, you have to have a question, and that's what this paper does. How can this civilization be explained? And then it gives you a little bit of historiography or the background history to this particular question. And it goes into a little bit about a paper written in 1936, which everything else sort of bounces off from. And then what he ends up doing is breaking up his paper into different sections. So why did this state occur? So there's 5 main approaches. So this particular article starts with one, and I've highlighted. The first approach is that the state emerged to construct and manage irrigation systems of the Nile flood. And then you can see, he says it's been discredited and gives you why. The second approach, population growth is the cause of increasing complexity. And then he says, you know, one problem with this is that the Nile Valley was underpopulated. It didn't have a large population. The third approach emphasizes trade. Doesn't really have a big ip with that, but you could definitely go through and read that. Fourth approach was something called an ecosystems approach, where the state emerges when they've adapted to their natural environment, which of course is what sustainability is all about. And then on the next page, the ecosystem approach has been criticized for several reasons, and he goes into that. Now he gets down to the meat of his article. My analysis of state formation emphasizes environmental factors and class conflict. And then he says his point of departure is the fifth approach. And then he talks about where he got his ideas from. Carnero in 1970 said that states are formed and successful because all the areas are circumscribed agricultural land, meaning there's a specific area that has agricultural land, and they might be, as you can see, set off by mountains, seas, deserts, or other environmental factors that keep people in a specific area. And he talks about exceptions, he talks about where this works. And then he goes in, and the 3 other factors which you have to think about when you're thinking about the beginning of the Egyptian state. So Egypt was agrarian, meaning agriculture. In fact, all of them were really based on agriculture. What's really interesting is that many of the other civilizations have cities. In ancient Egypt, you don't really have large cities. So he's saying you can think about the study of Egypt and the formation of the government without thinking about an urban economy. So urban just means city. Second, the relationship between the adoption of agriculture and the rise of state was different. And then he goes into why it was different. And then the Egyptian state governed a broad territory. And then he talks about why that's important. And remember, the whole point of his article is that the state could use the people who were living there because they couldn't really escape. They couldn't leave because of the geography. And then here's sort of like what I would call his thesis. I will show that the geography of Egypt presented a would-be ruling class with a particular set of possibilities, and that the pharaonic state was a sort of political system that best served the interests of such a class in such an environment. Now, the rest of his paper is going to be proving that. So he starts talking about agriculture and the creation of a social surplus. So what he's talking about is that there are two different types of surplus. One is production, which is, you grow food and then people eat it, and then what's left over is a surplus. And then he's talking about a labor surplus in the second sense, where you've got people, especially in Egypt, who are farming at a particular time of the year. And there's other times when they don't farm because of the natural flooding of the Nile. And then there's a labor surplus, which can be used for other things like building pyramids, fighting wars, and so on. He goes into a little bit of the history, which we already looked at in a previous week. Egyptians were engaged in foraging before they had agriculture, and he goes into some of the details of that. And then as soon as agriculture is introduced into Egypt, he believes that it made it possible for the government to exploit Egyptians because they would have surplus food that the state would take in taxes, and they'd have surplus labor, which they could use. And then he goes into a bit of the details here. And he talks about the adoption of agriculture and how it affected the food producing system. So storability. So you've got wheat and barley, which is dry and it's perfect to store. You'll find lots of early civilizations doing that. When you talk about production, you talk about how much food you can grow per acre, or in this case, per hectare. And so they talk about that. And then you can also look at production per worker. This says that there's not a lot of research done on this, but he looks at other areas where research has been done. And then there's the seasonability. So when the laborers are actually available to do that. And then he talks about, why was agriculture adopted when Egyptians were foraging food? Why do agriculture? And then he asks the questions. So what were the advantages and drawbacks of farming compared to the foraging system? And then he goes and answers those. And then he has a second question. Why did the shift to agriculture occur millennia after it had been adopted in the Near East? And then he goes to answer that. And then he gets in really to the meat of his argument, which is people moving around and then the state exploiting that particular labor. So I'm just going to scoot down here. Sorry, I hope you don't get motion sickness from this. Let me do this quickly. And then he talks about how the state actually takes this surplus and then what it ends up doing with it. And remember, he's talking about how the Nile Valley is very restricted, and so people can't just, say set up a farm along the Nile River, and then when they don't feel like doing it anymore, they get up and move east or west. Well, they can't do that in Egypt because of the desert. So that's one of his main points in this particular article. And then he goes through all the different reasons for that. And then he also thinks that it's possible that the national state was established and it might have pushed the transition from foraging to farming to its completion, which of course was faster than it was in other areas. And he talks about that. So let me go down further. And then you get to the conclusion. I don't really like the conclusion in this particular paper because it doesn't wrap things up. But you can see what the gist of the article is about. He's arguing that the state was able to exploit labor and exploit agriculture to grow into an ancient civilization. And again, before I forget, make sure you look through the references in case this is something that's interesting for you to use for your own podcast.